The contents of the canister stunned Ricky White. It was nearly a week before he told any member of the team what he had discovered, and even then, he did not mention the Green Book. But Joe West seemed to know that Ricky was hiding something. West confronted Ricky one night after they had interviewed an old friend of Roscoe's. Ricky remembers feeling emotionally overwhelmed and on the verge of tears. At that moment, he decided to show West the canister and its contents, all except the Green Book, and to give it to West for safekeeping. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jessica Knoll, and if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription. This is part 3 of our read-through of an article that was in December 1990 in Texas Monthly. We've gone back to it because it's one of those research pieces in this particular rabbit trail of the JFK investigation that people point back to often. It has the historicity that we need now in order to make sense of the Roscoe White story. To give you a little background, Roscoe White was a man who joined the Dallas Police Department in October of 1963. He left the force 2 years to the day after he had joined, so that would be October 1965, and did not re-enter police work. He had been a Marine. He was in the same division that went to Japan on the same boat for 5.5 months with Lee Harvey Oswald. And he had been at Atsugi base in Japan with Lee Oswald and other places as well. There is no verified evidence that they knew each other, but his wife claims that they did. He was later killed in an accidental explosion. He gave a deathbed information to people about that, which I suspect we're going to hear about in this episode. And also, we have followed the story of how his son became aware of his father's potential connection to the JFK assassination. Over the period of years, there were photographs, there was a secretive nature, and after his father passed, a packet was delivered that contained photos of Lee Harvey Oswald's body, photos of Lee Harvey Oswald, one of which was a fourth variation of the famous backyard rifle photos of Oswald, but this one had not been published. So there was photographic evidence that had not been publicly seen that someone delivered as having belonged to his father, and now that his father has passed, they were returning it to his wife because it had been asked to be kept for Roscoe White. So at the end of the last episode, what we read was that Geneva, who is the mother or the wife to Roscoe, and Ricky had been feverishly trying to seek additional information that they believed there was a packet, a little paper sack that had some tree bark in it, and it had numbers and the name Paris, and they realized maybe his dad had buried something at his grandparents' home in Paris, Texas. So now he has turned around and driven east to Paris. The subtitle for this section is The Ghoulish Green Book. It was late that night by the time Ricky reached the old house, which had been partially destroyed by fire. After breaking the lock on the front door, he searched the house by flashlight, first the downstairs and then the attic. Behind a piece of plywood, he saw a heavy aluminum canister sealed tight. "My heart was beating something awful," Ricky recalled. "I'm a pretty stout old boy, but I had to use a crowbar to pry it open." What he found were his father's Marine Corps dog tags, negatives of old family photographs, a faded green textbook with the newspaper pictures pasted over the pages, and 3 cables covered in protective plastic. I just want to remind you at this point, they had already been in touch with investigators. They had already been in touch with various first FBI agents, and then now they have people who are personally assisting them in investigating these matters. And even still, they hadn't discovered this information. And now they have. So this has a great deal of credibility to me because they did not have this information And now he's gone and he's found this information in real time while this JFK assassination researcher and his old pastor are assisting them. It's not something that, if you go back to episode 1, we learn a little bit about Ricky. It's not something that a simple country boy from Texas could just create. Let's see what is in here. The cables, so the 3 cables that were covered in protective plastic. The cables professed to be orders from naval intelligence addressed to Mandarin using Roscoe White's serial number. A cable dated October 1963 instructed Mandarin that his next assignment was, quote, to eliminate a national security threat to worldwide peace. At the bottom of the cables was the code name RE-rifle, and the RE are capitalized, RE-rifle, which was strikingly similar to ZR/rifle, an ultra-secret CIA project during the Kennedy administration to recruit assassins to murder foreign leaders. Wow. The Green Book, or the Witness Elimination Book, as it came to be called, frightened Ricky White more than all the other pieces of evidence put together. Though the contents of the book hardly supported such a conclusion, Ricky saw it as proof that his father had murdered repeatedly. This was some sort of ghoulish scrapbook, apparently compiled at random and embellished with numerical code and hieroglyphics. Inside the front cover was his father's name and serial number and the words players or witnesses. That part is in quotes, quote, players or witnesses, end quote. Pasted to each page were old newspaper photographs. Some were easily identifiable: Ruby, Oswald, Jack, and Robert Kennedy. But others were faces without names. One of the most obscure faces turned out to be the late Perry Raymond Rousseau, who once testified that he had attended a meeting in New Orleans where the plot to assassinate President Kennedy had been discussed. Also in attendance was Lee Harvey Oswald. Written below the picture were the words, "Big mouth, you talked after all," end quote. Wow, that is dark. So there's this meeting in New Orleans where the plot to assassinate President Kennedy had been discussed. Lee Harvey Oswald had been there. Perry Raymond Rousseau is one of the faces that's in this book of confirmed kills, with the words below it written, "Big mouth, you talked after all." Okay, I just looked in my copies of Forgive My Grief by Penn Jones and do not see that name in these books. However, I went and looked online and there are stories about Perry Raymond Rousseau. He testified with Jim Garrison in New Orleans, and so that must be what it refers to, is that he had been put to death afterwards. So that's another rabbit trail to sort out. But big mouth, you talked after all. I want to say, too, this, again, has the ring of credibility. Ricky White doesn't know all these names. He's not putting together this old scrapbook with, how would you even remake that? That would be very difficult to remake, even if you were a craftsman who did careful work with like IDs and old magazines, and to source that many documents and find old glue and old, journals and this and that, and to forge your father's handwriting. It's beyond what's forgeable. This seems credible. On another page was a copy of the famous Mary Mormon photograph, taken at the instant the president's head was blown open. I'll put that photo up here, and I'll just keep it up the whole time I'm talking. An X drawn across a spot behind the stockade fence marked the place where Mandarin would have stood. Below the picture were these words, quote, "Mandarin kills K, uses 7.65 Mauser in assassination." The author, Gary Cartwright, honestly tells us this. For 3 days after the assassination, the Dallas police, the district attorney, and even the CIA believed the murder weapon was a Mauser. One of the pieces of evidence that Ricky turned over to the research team was his father's 7.65 Mauser. Wow, y'all, that is big. I mean, to have had the Mary Mormon photograph, to have put an X on the spot, to put the words Mandarin kills K, uses 7.65 Mauser in assassination. That's a number of pieces of evidence that Ricky White does not have access to. He's not the one doing this. There's a photo, there's a spot chosen, there's particular words, and his father has the gun. And that is the gun that was initially reported by all the talking heads. Later, it's changed to be not the infield that was taken down the flight of stairs from the roof, and not the Mauser that was reported, but Lee Harvey Oswald's Italian-made Mannlicher Carcano was now all of a sudden the gun of choice. But prior to that, this weapon had been the focus. The contents of the canister stunned Ricky White. It was nearly a week before he told any member of the team what he had discovered, and even then, he did not mention the Green Book. But Joe West seemed to know that Ricky was hiding something. West confronted Ricky one night after they had interviewed an old friend of Roscoe's. Ricky remembers feeling emotionally overwhelmed and on the verge of tears. At that moment, he decided to show West the canister and its contents, all except the Green Book, and to give it to West for safekeeping. But rather than share this new evidence with other members of the team, West took it to Houston and locked it in his safe deposit box. He eventually supplied the others with copies of the cables, but the originals remained locked in his bank box until Matsu filed a lawsuit. So Ricky trusts West because he's a part of the investigation. He's this like PI that has been hired and contracted by Gary Shaw to help the investigation. And up until this point has proven fairly helpful. But now he takes this information and locks it in a safe deposit box in Houston, away from the other team members. Matsu had to file a lawsuit. West countersued, charging that he had been libeled and his life had been threatened. When Gary Shaw discovered that his partners had been right all along, that Joe West was a loose cannon, he terminated his relationship with the Houston investigator. But it was too late. Joe West and his new associate, the Reverend Jack Shaw, were pursuing a separate investigation. Apparently, West had appointed himself custodian of the evidence. Gary Shaw and his partners had Ricky and the Green Book, but West had the cables. And even more important, with Jack Shaw on his team, West had Geneva. So now we've got rivaling factions. We have Ricky White and Geneva. I mean, frankly, this sounds so country, doesn't it? It sounds like an episode of Maury Povich, for those of us who remember that. It sounds so unsophisticated for them not to be able to come together and say, for the good of our father, for the good of the story, let's go ahead and work together. Let's take the journal. Let's take the cables. Let's get these other people out of our faces, and let's you and I work together. Instead, we have Geneva, the Reverend Jack Shaw, and Joe West, the rebel investigator, are off on this side with the cables that Ricky had found, and then Ricky and Gary Shaw and the Dallas investigative crew on this side. The next subtitle is One Hell of a Woman. From the start, the team had worked too slowly for Joe West's taste, not being aggressive enough with potential witnesses and missing what he regarded as obvious clues. West outraged Ricky by claiming that Roscoe White's old friend Bill X was a member of the assassination squad. Shaw and his partners worried that West would compromise their investigation and maybe subject the JFK Center to a slander suit. Such petty considerations did not bother Joe West, who vowed he would pursue Kennedy's killer until his dying day. Like a mighty army marching across the land, West proclaimed, when justice is done, that will be my payday. From his mafia informant, who told him that 5 mafia big shots were in Dallas on the day of the assassination, West had already extrapolated another gunman on the Grassy Knoll. Even before Geneva had identified Charles Nicoletti as the man she had met in New Orleans, West had come to the conclusion that Nicoletti was one of the Kennedy assassins. On May 11th, he called a press conference in Galveston to make this startling announcement. But this was just a warm-up for the big event. In mid-September 1990, West sent out press releases announcing another press conference and hinting that at long last he was about to produce the smoking gun. It seemed that a second Roscoe White journal had surfaced. Geneva had found it 2 weeks earlier, found it quite by coincidence when she happened to knock over a book titled Presidents of the United States. It was hidden under Kennedy John F. Funny, Geneva hadn't mentioned it to me, though I had interviewed her at home just days after this astonishing discovery. That's Gary Cartwright, the author of the article, saying, I talked to Geneva just days after she reportedly found this, and she failed to mention it to me. She hadn't even mentioned it to the other members of her own family. Instead, she had turned the journal over to Jack Shaw and Joe West. And though it wasn't exactly a quid pro quo, she simultaneously received a payment of $5,300. Part of it a gift from the film producer Oliver Stone, who had begun filming his movie by this point, and the remainder from Jack Shaw's ministry. Standing with his back to a banner proclaiming Truth, Inc., West told several dozen reporters that he was only a certified legal investigator licensed by the state of Texas, not a documents expert, so he couldn't vouch for the authenticity of this new piece of evidence. But the fact that he had gone to all this trouble to make it public suggested otherwise. The night before the press conference, Jack Shaw had spoken of this breakthrough as, quote, one of the most historically important events of the 20th century. Apparently, Shaw changed his mind because the next morning he pleaded with West to postpone the announcement until experts could examine the document. But West's mind was made up, and wild mustangs couldn't have dragged him off the rostrum. Halfway through the press conference, Shaw slipped out of the room and flew back to Dallas. So, Jack Shaw, the Reverend, ends up getting pulled into what sounds like a fake journal find. And he gets pulled in and sucked in and excited about it before it's actually verified. He realizes it halfway through the press conference and flies back to Dallas. Lots of conspiracy theory folks end up lacking credibility for things like this. You attach yourself too quickly to something that seems exciting. A found journal by a main player, wow. But now she's making this part up, it seems. Let's see. Almost everyone who saw the journal believed it was a fraud. John Stockwell, the CIA agent turned author, pronounced this work. Now, reminder, this is the new journal that had just been found at this time. So this is not the original journal, and it's not the book of the kill list that Ricky has been talking about. This is a different journal. The CIA agent turned author John Stockwell pronounced the work a crude fabrication, pointing out that though the journal was supposedly written between 1957 and 1971, it appeared to be written in the same felt tip pen. Felt tip pens weren't used until the early 60s. A more obvious flaw was a mention on the next to last page of Watergate. Apparently, Watergate was to be Roscoe's last assignment, which he refused. The problem with this, other than believing that a man who had killed the president and numerous others would dig in his heels at the idea of taking part in a two-bit burglary, is that the break-in at the Watergate apartment complex didn't occur until 10 months after Roscoe White died. I mean, okay, yes and no. Remember, we were told that Geneva had been approached a month or two before his death and told, we have a new assignment for your husband. Tell him to contact us within 48 hours. And when he didn't, that's when the murder had happened. Remember, we read in our first episode, I will refresh your memory, on the trip to New Orleans, a strange and sinister man had approached Geneva in a nightclub, reminded her about Rock's part in the Kennedy assassination, and told her, we have another job for Rock. Tell him he has 48 hours to get in touch. Apparently, White never got in touch with the man. In September, so this was in the summer of 1971, in September, he was fatally burned when a leak in an acetylene torch flamed up, causing a can of chemicals that was stored under his workbench to explode. On his deathbed, he told Reverend Jack Shaw that it was no accident and that he had seen a man running from the explosion. Basically, a can had been opened to full throttle, and so when he went to use his torch, the whole thing exploded, and he received injuries, which he died from less than 24 hours later. So, all that to say, he was recruited in the summer of 1971. He died in September of 1971. And this author is saying the Watergate didn't happen for 10 months later. So what's the deal? Like, that didn't even happen until after. And I don't think that necessarily correlates. Now, I'm not arguing to vouch for this journal. It sounds like the journal's a bunch of hooey. But could that have been the final thing that he was going to be recruited for? Absolutely. Do we think that people only start preparing for an assignment the week of? Or is it possible that they get certain things in place beforehand? I think that's possible. I don't know. What do you guys think? I just don't think that the fact that the Watergate happened after he passed is evidence that that wasn't the assignment he was being recruited for. I think he could have still had been recruited for that. Whether or not the journal's authentic, that's unrelated to this particular question. The scandal that we now know as Watergate wasn't called that until weeks after the break-in. When I mentioned this to Joe West after the press conference, he became indignant and gave me a lecture about how the term Watergate is more than 2,000 years old and appears in the 3rd chapter of the book of Nehemiah. That there is a place called the Watergate is not the same as there being an event in America that we call Watergate. Like, that is ridiculous. Regardless, it does sound like this journal may have been a hoax. What do you guys think? Let me know what you think, but that's where I stand. The new journal fractured the tentative harmony within the White family. That's not my daddy's handwriting, Ricky protested, and that's not the way he wrote. There was a whiny, cringing, self-pitying tone to the prose, strikingly unlike Roscoe White's lean, sparse style. The language was turgid, overburdened with regrets for what a rotten husband he had been, and gushing with appreciation for Geneva. God, thank you for Geneva. I've got me one hell of a woman. Thank you, God. So in this journal, this fraudulent journal, not only did she write with a pen that was not of the period, she used terms that were not of the period. It was all written with the exact same pen, not in Roscoe White's handwriting. But also, she takes the opportunity to really praise herself as if like her husband's just sitting over there journaling about her, because that's the kind of man he was while he was off having affairs. He's also thanking God for Geneva. Ricky and Trisha believe that Geneva created the journal. I think that's a sound supposition, given her nearly hopeless financial situation and the constant admonitions of others imploring her to come up with some new piece of evidence, something else. The creation could be viewed more as an act of desperation than a hoax. Yeah, I think that's fair. Unfortunately, this act of desperation has consequences. The article continues, maybe it shouldn't, but this latest journal tends to discredit all the other evidence. If the entire Roscoe White story is a hoax, and that is a distinct possibility, it is a hoax created by someone with an impressive knowledge of assassination details, a good grasp of intelligence operations, and some insight into organized crime. Maybe Roscoe White himself perpetrated the deceit, or maybe it was the work of his mysterious friend, Bill X, with some help from Geneva. Considering all the bizarre happenings since 1963, the scenario appears rather tame. If you want to fault the Roscoe White story, fault it first for its lack of imagination. That's the end of the article. So, this gives us a lot to ponder. To me, Roscoe is suspicious here. Too much interconnectedness with Lee Harvey Oswald. Such a short duration at the Dallas Police Department. The books found by Roscoe, I wonder if there is photographic proof, like maybe this researcher Gary Shaw or others have photographic proof of this green kill book that we heard about. To me, that would be compelling to see. Frankly, that would be crazy to see. And then Geneva, she's a rough woman with a tough background. She apparently does this, what does he call it, act of desperation, or we could call it a hoax, of creating a new journal, which then discredits all the other things that do seem evidentiary. They do seem to have important historical evidence qualities to them. But her fake journal flubbed up the whole thing. The photos with Lee Harvey Oswald, the photo of her with Jack Ruby, a lot of that has real credibility to me. What do you think? Let me know in the comments what you make of this story of I Was Mandarin, Roscoe White. Was he actually the shooter on the grassy knoll? Was he there behind the stockade fence? Or is he pulling our leg? That is the question as the headline of this article. It's the question we're all left to ponder. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I look forward to reading it. Next time we will be reading this article, which was written December 13th, 1963. President Johnson at his White House desk. We will be reading about the continued makeover of Lyndon Baines Johnson in the media, and particularly through this publication of Life magazine. If you missed the last episode about that, you want to go back and see it, because I looked at the articles that had been written about an LBJ contact and LBJ himself in the 2 weeks leading up to the Kennedy assassination. And then we looked at the tone shift that happened immediately following the assassination. So this will give us 1 month on, just really 3 weeks into his presidency, what is being said about LBJ. So I hope you'll come back for that. I look forward to your comments. I love the comment section, but especially with this Roscoe White article. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. I hope you have a great day. Bye.